Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Silver Mont, and this is my review of Final Fantasy VIII Remastered on Steam. Disclaimer time. I received a review copy of this game from Square Enix for the purposes of, well, you guessed it, reviewing. And there was no monetary compensation involved, so let's kick things off. Oh, and the Final Fantasy VIII Remaster is available on Steam, Xbox, PS4, and Switch. I'm going to talk more about the game and how it compares with the original, than reviewing the base game as a whole. But let's talk about that briefly, the base game. Final Fantasy VIII was originally a PS1 release and tells the story of Balam Garden's Squall, with a story involving memory loss and manipulation, orphan mercenaries and powerful sorceresses. Now I can't actually tell you too much about the story of Final Fantasy VIII, as the last time I played it was about 20 years ago. I know I didn't get past disc 2 of the PlayStation original. I borrowed it from a friend back in school. Friend I'm actually playing Final Fantasy XIV with, like 2 decades later. Fun times. But gameplay wise, Final Fantasy VIII is, at surface level, similar to VII, in that it uses a turn-based battle system with random encounters, a world map for you to traverse, party members that you can swap in and out, along with summons. There'll be mini-games for you to do, but the mechanics in Final Fantasy VIII specifically are interesting, and somewhat busted in some ways. Take limit breaks. In many other Final Fantasy games, you build your limit break gradually over time until you can use it to unleash a strong attack. In Final Fantasy VIII, it's more like a panic button. The closer to death your characters become, the more peril they are in, the lower health they have, the more status ailments they are suffering from, the higher your chance of having a limit break. This means that sometimes you'll be able to use a limit break continuously, every turn, and in general it can rather be exploited, a little bit like hyper mode in some other games such as Dark Souls or Demon Souls with the clever rat ring, the red tearstone ring, you get the idea. Then we have the Junction System, which is not easy to explain, but in essence you equip summons to your party members which enhance their stats initially, and then you can equip magic to your stats as well. For example, you can equip the Cure magic spell to your health stat to give you a higher health stat. Which leads us into the draw system. Instead of just learning the Cure spell in Final Fantasy VIII or learning Fire, Faraga, you will draw it. In essence, you absorb magic spells from enemies, and then you build up an inventory stock of them, so you can be walking around with 100 Cure spells that you can then cast in combat, as well as equipping to your stats, junctioning them to beef those stats. It's a sort of progression to the materia system from VII, but I'm not sure how I feel about it. Whilst interesting, I think it's a little bizarre and it feels a bit like they were going, well, how can we spice things up for the sake of it, when I don't know if it really needed spicing up. But hey, maybe if this was your 8th Final Fantasy game in a row, in short succession, then maybe it would need spicing up. For me, I've always had huge gaps between my Final Fantasies. It's not my favourite system though, I'll tell you that right now. But fundamentally, it works, and whilst the tutorials are a little odd, once you actually start playing around with it, it makes sense pretty quick. Visually, Final Fantasy VIII went for a more realistic style than VII, and the advance in graphics, for the time, was very impressive. It's one of the first games I can think of that managed to blend full motion video with in-game graphics models. But how do these visuals hold up 20 years later in this remaster? Well, you might be wondering, what are we getting in this remaster? What exactly is being remastered? So far as I can see, the character models for your party members, NPCs, summons, various vehicles and other 3D models you'll find in the world have been upgraded quite drastically, but that's about it. The FMVs, whilst the same FMVs, they're higher quality, as they no longer need to be compressed insanely just to fit on a CD that can only hold a few 100 megabytes of data. The music, meanwhile, seems more or less untouched. Maybe it's a higher sample rate, but the best thing we can say about the music is it isn't weird low quality MIDI files like what VII had on the PC a while back. The game's backgrounds haven't been touched, so far as I can see, unless they've been run through some very basic kind of filter, which is disappointing. The main reason it looks different is because it's a lot higher resolution, so things are a lot less grainy, they're a lot clearer, but that also means they're a lot more jagged, and faults are more exposed as they're essentially being blown up. Whilst the assets looked great 20 years ago, being designed for a resolution of, 480p, probably less than that even, they leave something to be desired in 2019. The game also doesn't support widescreen in that sense. The backgrounds were designed for square like screens and resolutions. They are still square. Whilst I think it's understandable that the full motion videos haven't been changed, as that would require remaking every single FMV in the game, the fact that the backgrounds haven't been changed, I think is a shame. These are essentially just 2D images that are layered sometimes on top of each other, and it isn't that hard to edit a 2D image. At worst, it requires some redrawing, and at best, merely cropping. Considering this is a remaster, I think that's something they could have and should have done. A remaster, to me, sort of implies they're making it remastered for current technology, and 720p's been around for more than 10 years now. This aspect ratio of widescreen has been around for quite a long time, so I feel like they should have done the backgrounds as well. I do take umbrage with the term remaster being used in video games when they are barely upgrading it. I mean, look at the Dark Souls remaster. It upgraded some elements, and it downgraded other elements. Ultimately, it provided an experience that was arguably worse than the original in some ways, with inferior matchmaking algorithms for netplay. As for Final Fantasy VIII, you've got to pick and mix it. It's not a straight upgrade. Some aspects are better, but it's more of a port than a remaster, if you ask me. But let's go through the good and the bad, starting with the good. It runs just fine on a technical level in that you don't need to worry about installing it and getting the game going, at least on Steam. Older versions can be nefariously weird. When you're looking at 20-year-old games and trying to get them running on a modern PC, sometimes you run into all sorts of issues. They're like, oh, you need DirectX 2, or you need to install this or that, or you get compatibility issues, and none of that is here. It's painless, which is what you want. The new character models are fine. I'm sure some people will prefer the original. I think these new ones are faithful to the original whilst providing a lot more detail and clarity. The FMVs are clearer, and the optional boosts in the remaster make for a huge quality of life change. More on that in a moment, but first let's cover the downsides. As of the time I'm writing this script, there's no analog movement in the remaster, which feels bad. What do I mean by no analog movement? In essence, if you try and move your character in a smooth circle, they'll instead be locked to 8 directions. Imagine the difference between a D-pad and an analog stick, and you get the idea. It makes the game just feel clunky, and I'm not a fan of it. I had to check that it was in the original PS1, and it 100% is. I looked at videos. Why it's being excluded here? Baffling to me. I can only assume it has something to do with this version of the game being based on the old PC version of the game, which, so far as I recall, also didn't have analog movement. So even if you're playing on the PS4 or another console version, I imagine they are also using this old PC version as a base, probably because that was the most readily available and easiest to edit, but that's mere speculation. Game also has some really weird framerate issues. Not sure exactly what's going on, but the framerate of menus seems to be really low and not as smooth as it should be. Can't quite put my finger on it, but they need to fix it because it feels really bad when you're trying to do a limit break and you're like looking at this bar that's going along the screen, hardly ever being refreshed. It's not smooth at all and it's bad. But how about those boosts I mentioned earlier? Well, the remaster of FF8 comes with several boosts that can be activated by clicking in the analog sticks. There's one boost that speeds up the game by like 3 times. Whilst it doesn't work in some cutscenes, it's incredible how much nicer this makes the game to play. It existed in Final Fantasy XII's re-release as well, what was that, last year, year before? And then as now, it was a lifesaver. It means you can scuttle around the map much faster. When you're in battles or just grinding and hitting attack over and over again, it makes that a lot nicer. It's such a simple thing, but you'd be amazed at how much use you'll get out of it. The other boosts I've not really played about with as much. There's one that seems to disable random encounters. I mean, I guess that would be good, but I need that AP for my Guardian Forces, so I'm not going to do that. And another one which instantly fills your limit break meter in combat, for when you just want to go nuts, I suppose. I feel like that one's a bit more of a cheat than a boost, but oh well. And the Steam version of the remaster also comes with a bunch of actual in-game cheats that you can turn on if you're so inclined. I don't remember what they are off the top of my head, but I think it's things like maxing out all your triple triad cards, maxing out your spell inventory so you have like 100 of all the spells. Also, these cheats aren't in the console version, I believe, but the boosts, like maxing out your limit break and moving 3 times faster, those are. So if you're playing on the PS1 version still, is there any reason to upgrade? Well, the boosts and updated character models are nice, but the game as a whole, it has the FPS problem with the menus, and it has the lack of the 3D movement, which I don't like. So I wouldn't really suggest it, but if you want to play the game on PS4, Xbone, Switch, PC, then good time to pick it up. I really hope they'll put out a patch sometime soon to fix these problems, as that would make it a lot easier to recommend it. In general, this feels more of like a mobile phone port than a proper remastering, but then I just have really high expectations of remasters, possibly because it has the word master in it, but hey. If you're looking for a really good Final Fantasy remaster though, look at Final Fantasy Tactics on the Android and iOS port, where they kept the original sprite style. You know, they still look like the original ones, but a little cleaner. They added new cutscenes, and in general they kept the spirit of the game the same, whilst making it more playable. Compared to that updated version of Final Fantasy VI, where the sprites just look absolutely horrible. But to sum up for Final Fantasy VIII Remaster, boosts are great. New models look nice. The fact they haven't touched the backgrounds is very disappointing, and they need to patch in some of the missing or broken elements, such as 3D analog movement and fixing the frame rate. But thank you so much for watching, and if there's any questions you have for things that I didn't cover in the video, feel free to ask them down below, and I'll get back to you ASAP. Ciao.